University of Wisconsin-Madison, obviously in economics. And her research area is primarily in development economics, and today's presentation is entitled The Challenges of World Poverty. So without further ado, please welcome Professor B. Roberts.
Thank you for inviting me, and it's nice to see familiar faces around the room. I teach the development economics sequence here in the economics department, and so it's been a lot of fun for me to think about development, to teach development, when you start thinking along these lines, it's very hard to stop. And so today's talk, I'm just going to expose you to a little bit of what are the latest research work in development, what are the kinds of progress that's being made, and how do economists look at the issue of alleviating poverty around the world. So the plan of tonight's talk, I'm going to introduce, when I talk about modern economic growth, what do I mean? What time period do I refer to? Then I'm going to move on to talk about how economists identify the poor in developing countries with new tools. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about some facts about poverty that you may or may not know. How do economists today address poverty? What are the policy implications? And then end up with some conclusions. So feel free to ask questions as I speak, or you can wait until the end of the talk. I'll give some time for questions. How much time do I have? An hour? Okay, so when we talk about economic growth, modern economic growth, be aware that we're really starting from the year 1800, because if this is the time frame, 0 AD to 2000 today, you can see that for much of history, there's really zero growth. In fact, if you extend this line all the way to 1,000,000 BC, you will find that there's really no growth at all. And that economic growth actually started during the Industrial Revolution, about 1850. So when you think about when that started, when that slope started getting really steep from 1% to double that, 2.25%, you think, wow, 1850, that's a long time ago. But really, it's not that long, because if you look at the history of humankind, modern economic growth, starting from 1850 till today, is really just the width of a golf ball. If you think of this as the width of a football field, 1850 is the width of a golf ball placed right at the end of the football. So modern economic growth is a pretty recent phenomenon. Recent in the light of the history of humankind, not in our framework, right? So we're lucky, because we're lucky that we don't live during this time, right? Because then you're just a couch potato. There's nothing much to do. There's nothing happening in the world. But where we're living is actually during a period of time in which world population growth, as well as world kind of growth in GDP, the red line is the annual growth of the world population. This is the absolute increase in world population. And you can see that it peaked like around 1980. So when you were born is already past the peak of population growth in the world. Interesting. So right now, we're on the downward trend. And so 2017 we are basically right at this point here where world population growth taken together is less than 1%. It peaked at 2.1. Now, that's average across all the countries in the world. So when you're talking about, and the world is heterogeneous, and so you'll have lots of countries with much higher than 2.1%, many that are much lower, but on average is about 2.1. Where are the poor? Where do they live? So if I were to ask you the question, do the poor live in poor countries, middle income countries, or rich countries, what would be your answer? Yeah.
Poor countries?
Actually, that's wrong. So the poor live in, when you think about which are the big countries in the world, it's India and China, right? India and China are middle income countries, they're not poor countries, right? And so in fact, if, where are the poor? Okay, I went forward, I'm not going to talk about that just yet. Where are the poor? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the new tools, the new technology to find the poor, right? If you want to help the poor, Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation have a lot of money that they want to put into different areas in the world to help the poorest of the poor. You've got to figure out where they are. Figuring out where the poor are is very hard because even in developed countries, identifying the poor, you can use social security number and all the characteristics in poor countries is almost non-existent. So household income data surveys are really expensive, they are time consuming, and they are costly. And so they don't get done very much. To implement any kind of social programs, you need to identify where the poor are. You need to be able to target recipients in areas where the poor live. So like in a country like India, it's the poor don't have an address. They don't certainly have a social security number. And so it's really tough to identify who it is that you want to give cash to if you want to help them. India started to try and change that. But generally for most poor countries, the countries in Africa, it is tough to identify where the poor live. Today, what we have to correct that problem are satellite images that could predict where the poor live using kind of information that we have. GPS satellite imaging and big data is often the tool that is used. I'm sure some of you have already seen night lights taken from space, where you basically have an image of the Earth at night with all the lights, and the lights represent places that are actually have very different levels of income because you can look at the intensity of the light. The more intense the light is, the higher is the income of the area. So they combine night lights with daytime images, and we'll talk about a little bit more about that, and also using mobile phones. There's a current study on Rwanda where mobile phone data is being used to identify who the poor are and where they live. A lot of poor people have mobile phones for their businesses. They have mobile phones before they have anything else, like a TV, etc. So you can use information that they record on the mobile phones to figure out their characteristics. And you can also, what they've done is to use how long they make phone calls to identify whether they're actually poor, middle income, or rich. The poor tend to have very short phone messages because they want to conserve the SIM card or whatever the memory that they have. And so mobile phone technology has really grown and has enabled people to actually predict where the poor live and what they look like. So you've seen probably, this is not a really good image, but this is the Earth at night, right? And you can see that the lights are there. And these satellite night lights are a proxy for different kinds of economic activity. And you'll see that Africa is pretty much in the dark. So you combine the night lights with daytime satellite images, and your daytime satellite images will capture things like a dam, a farm, paved road, urban areas, all kinds of economic activity. And you can use those images as markers to distinguish different levels of economic well-being. So you take something like Africa at night, you combine that with images of Africa, where you know where the roads are, farmland, urban areas, waterways, because that's a signal of activity. You combine these images with machine learning algorithms, and then you can basically categorize. So the machine, you feed into the machine this kind of information, and you can tell the machine to go look for waterways, roads, etc. And then you put income level on those features, right? And so you can have an image like this during the day. This is in Nairobi. So this is the slums, and right next to the slums are, a residential area. So you can tell, from the machine will be able to tell, from these images what the levels of income roughly are. And then they match this with surveys to figure out how good they are at predicting poverty. So that's so much for new tools in our ability to identify where the poor live. One of our colleagues, Mike Gector, actually is a development economist that has been using satellite images in his own research work. And it's just fascinating work because you can take a picture, of a city from the air, and by the color and the shine of the rooftop, you should be able to figure out whether the roof, how old the roof is, right? And so the yellow rectangles, in these two images, this was taken in July 2009, this in 3 years later in August 2012, and you can see that the color of the roof has changed over the 3-year period. So this has deteriorated, that has been changed to been upgraded, right? So what he does is to show how different policies that have been implemented in the slums of Nairobi or India, I think his study is on India, how over time people's income as they change, they start to replace their roof. And then you can identify who has actually effectively used the income to upgrade the quality of their living everywhere. So it's incredible, trying to use these new tools in very, very innovative ways, because in developing countries, they don't have the luxury of big data. They don't have the luxury of a lot of things that we take for granted. Some interesting facts on poverty, and this is something that you may know, you may not know. So the first fact we talked about is the paradox, where most of the world's poor, identified as people who live on $2 or less a day, do not live in poor countries. They actually live in middle-income countries, because India and China, they have 50% of the world's poor people. India and China are middle-income countries. And so that's something which is, the poor are very different, right? Poverty is relative. Somebody who's poor in this country is not necessarily poor somewhere else. But the poor have something in common. The poor are the people generally that do not benefit from economic growth. They live in remote areas away from the big cities, and that's why even with the huge growth in China and India, you find that because the people in the remote areas are so removed from all these benefits, income inequality actually just pulls people apart. That as growth continues, both these countries, India and China, their level of income inequality has actually grown by a whole lot, because the poor are actually just removed from all the benefits of growth. So, How do the poor cope with poverty? That's another interesting fact about poverty. And what I do in a class, is to have students read a book by Banerjee and Duflo called Poor Economics. Those of you who are with me in my current class know a lot about what is in this book. Basically, these two authors spend years in poor countries trying to understand how do the poor make decisions about what food they buy, what kind of health facility services they are part of, what kind of education for their children, etc. How do they make the decisions and why? And this is in the attempt to try and understand how can you actually help the poor if you don't understand how they make their decisions. And the book is an attempt to try and understand the behavior of the poor and not just assume that they would do what we think they should do, right? Which is what most policies in alleviating poverty focus on is we think the poor should behave in this way, so let's just give foreign aid in this amount and we should be able to help them, right? And so this book is an attempt to try and say, wait a minute, I think there's more to it than that. So there are two examples that to illustrate this point. We all know that the poor need calories, and that the poor are generally, they don't get enough calories, and therefore they don't get the energy that they need to be productive, and therefore to earn an income that is above the poverty line. So we expect that the expenditures on food of the poor should tilt heavily towards food because food provides the calories at a given price. Do we see that? That when they have an income increase, do we see the poor buying more calories? I'll give you an answer in the next slide. So the second example is on immunization. Immunization is the most effective way for the poor to take care of their children, right? Health care for their children. But immunization is at abysmal rates in poor villages. We don't know why, right? And so what Banerjee and Duflo does is they go into the villages and they try and figure out how is it that if you know that getting your child immunized is able to save you tons of money later on, why aren't you doing it? Especially when they are for free. So I have a student in my class who draws cartoons, and I asked him to illustrate for me this point that I had. So he came up with this cartoon, and if you read the cartoon, maybe you can figure out what it is that the poor, so on the left, it's a rich guy is trying to give this poor guy some free rice, right? The poor guy is malnourished, he's skinny, he should have the calories, he needs the calories. But then the poor guy turns around, look, he's carrying this box with a McDonald's thing on it, and says, you know what, I would rather have a hamburger. So clearly, a policy that tries to provide more calories for poor people by giving them free rice or subsidized rice is not going to be very successful, because the poor really may not want the kind of calories you're trying to give them because it doesn't taste very good, right? So what they found is that in practice, what the poor do is instead they buy more expensive, tastier junk food like we do. Eating well is just as important as eating enough. So the poor may not have enough calories, but they don't really concerned about that. They just want tastier food. Here's the second example. as regards to healthcare, you find that the poor tend not to go for prevention, immunization, vaccination. What they found in these Indian villages is that the poor think that it's a waste of money, even though they are given out for free and they're very, very effective. And you think, well, is it because the poor don't care about the health of their children or their own health? And it's not true, because if they do get sick, if their children do get sick, they spend tons of money for cures, tons of money going to the hospital to try and get better. So is it rational? Why aren't they spending the money to prevent getting sick? Why would they spend a lot more money once they get sick? This is what they found. They tend to spend money on expensive cures rather than a preventive measure, not because of the cost, but since benefits are not immediate, but they are in the future, the poor procrastinate. So this goes through the whole book that they wrote in Poor Economics, that the poor are just like us. When something is a benefit that is in the future, it's very easy to tell yourself, well, I don't really need it now. I can put it off. And they procrastinate, and by the time, it's just too late, right? And so the lesson from Poor Economics is that the poor are just like us. They prefer and are willing to spend on tastier food, and they have the tendency to procrastinate. The difference between the poor and us is that a bad decision on the part of the poor can be catastrophic, right? They don't have the degrees of freedom to afford to make a bad decision. If they make a bad decision about their harvest, about fertilizer, they get a bad harvest, their family starve. So they don't have savings. They don't have, like us, we procrastinate and we say, well, too bad, we'll just have to spend more money, to make up for that. But the poor don't have that ability. And so one example that is really important in the book is about chlorination. Chlorinizing your water is really, really cheap. And the poor knows, 98% of the poor, when you interview them, they know that if they chlorinate the water, their children will be protected against all kinds of waterborne diseases. And yet, the poor don't do it. Why don't they do it? It's because it takes time, you have to think about it. And my children don't always get sick. Sometimes they get sick, and so this ability to kind of rationalize and take the risk is something which is they worry about, they get more benefits from consumption now. Any kind of consumption in the future is something that they don't worry as much about. Or investment in the future is not something they worry as much about. So the bottom line of all this is that a good policy needs to take into account all these facts. And the bottom line really is, just like us, we don't need to chlorinate our water. Our water is already chlorinated for us, right? We don't need to worry about immunization of our kids, because if you don't get immunized, you can't get into school. So all these things are maybe paternalistic. This is what the government does in a rich country. It takes the worry about these things away from your minds. With the poor, they have to decide on every single thing regarding their lives and the health of the children and education of the children. So what is the policy implication? Is that try and make some things easy for them. You could put chlorine right at the tap, at the well where they get water, so that they know exactly how much chlorine to add. So that's easy access. Making things easy, just like things are easy for us. We can make things easy for the poor at a very low cost. So that's kind of a policy conclusion that we, okay. So one of the most important questions in development is, how do you help the poor, right? We talked a little bit about that in the previous slides. But most people will say, well, let's look at foreign aid. But foreign aid is clearly very controversial because we argue that it may not be going to the right people because of corruption, or we worry whether or not it's effective. And we worry about the consequence of foreign aid, that perhaps it fosters more dependence of people, that are used to aid. Today, there's a clear movement away from having big answers, universal answers to poverty. We want to cure everybody of something. The importance today of collecting data, of having your policy be based on evidence, is something which is clearly more important. We have access to better quality data, and more importantly, we have a new powerful tool, and those of you in my classes will learn about this tool that's called randomized controlled trials. This is nothing really new. Randomized controlled trials were something that's adopted from the medical field. If you want to figure out whether a drug is good or not, you subject it to an experiment. You have a control group that doesn't get the drug. You have a treatment group that gets the drug. You compare the two after effect to see if the drug is effective. So, randomized controlled trials is applying the same technique to social questions. And we'll do two examples of these questions. It's a growing methodology that are used by economists, and basically trying to address micro-policy questions, not big thing questions, but breaking down the big question into little steps and saying we can handle the little steps, and we'll know what works and what doesn't work. So there are two of them that I want to very quickly talk about. How do you incentivize parents to immunize their infants? That's one question. You can do it in various ways, but let's see what randomized controlled trials have done to inform us about what's the best way. The second one was, what is the most effective way to get children to school? So one on education, one obviously on health. Immunization is interesting because to get immunized, it takes work. It is not just one shot, right? You remember getting a series of shots? How many shots do you need to be fully immunized? 3? Are you sure? Because these guys say 5. They have to get, so you need a series of 5 shots to be fully immunized. And so that's planning, that's work. Mothers who take their infants to the clinics, they need to take off from work. So that's the opportunity cost of immunization. Sometimes they have to walk miles to the clinic, to the closest clinic, and then the clinic is closed, all right? Or they walk miles and then the doctors are not there. And so they get discouraged. And then they rationalize, well, I really might not need to immunize my baby because my neighbor didn't do it and their children are fine, right? And so there's this rationalization process that goes on. So an RCT was conducted in India, in the Udaipur district, which consists of about 134 villages. And what they found is that the kids there under the age of 5, only 2.6% of them are fully immunized. Some of them will have 1 shot, some of them have 2 shots, but only 2.6% of them were fully immunized at all the shots that made immunization an effective way to prevent diseases in the future. So what they did was to say parents are asked to try and work on both the supply and demand side. What they did was to organize camps. So once camps are organized, you know that the clinic will be open, right? So that solves the supply problem. You don't when you go to the clinic, you know that your child will be immunized instead of wasting your time. The availability of camps and timing were advertised widely, and the people who received immunization were paid, right? But what's more interesting is in some villages, so they had camps for some of the villages. In other villages, in addition to the camps, they had 1 kilo of lentils was given for each immunization and a set of plates for complete immunization. And so this is just a way to bribe the parents to say, if you do it now. So this is trying to correct for the procrastination. That instead of saying, I will do it tomorrow, I will do it next week, do it now. You do it now and you'll get a bag of lentils. And if you finish the immunization, you'll get something else. So what they found is that it was so effective that if the control group had immunization go up by 6% over the time period, if you just had the camps but no gifts, it went up by 17%. The rate of immunization skyrocketed to 38% when you had the camp plus the lentils. This was a very cheap way. A bag of lentils doesn't cost very much. And yet the bag of lentils was a way to get people to show up, get babies immunized, and then you don't have to deal with the problems later on. So the conclusion from that is it's possible to make pure supply-side interventions work, but given the state of demand, you have to try and influence the demand side, and it was cheaper than originally thought. They just had to give people something to motivate them to show up. The most effective way to get kids to school, it turns out, there are so many different ways. And in some ways, you think all of them should work. Giving kids textbooks, giving school meals, having more teachers, having better buildings. All these things help education, right? But what they found was that in some villages where worms are big problems, if you deworm the kids, it had an incredible effect on the attendance of these kids, the health of these kids, the performance of these kids. So intestinal worms, among the most widespread health problems in poor countries. It's also contagious, so that if you get rid of the worms with some kids, it doesn't spread, and you find that neighboring villages are actually positively affected when one village gets dewormed, the other village doesn't get the disease. So there are a lot of spillovers that suggest that the benefits are much, much bigger than the original cause. So they track these kids over time. These are just studies on the kids that were dewormed, and they found that over time, many, many years later, these kids that were dewormed had earnings, in their jobs that are significantly greater than the kids that were in the control group. So this is what you can do with randomized control trials. You can try and figure out the effectiveness of something, and then you can track some of these people over time to see whether it has long-term effects as well. And it's cheap. Deworming is 65 cents per kid. And these are the benefits in terms of the extra earnings that they get over time. So to conclude, Max Hartwell, a famous economic historian, says that economics is essentially a study of poverty, right? If you're studying economic growth, it is studying how people achieve positive welfare by starting from a situation of poverty and moving up. Given that most people in the world are poor, if we can understand the economics of being poor, we would know much of the economics that really matters. We would be able to understand how economics can improve the lives of the people who are poor. Understanding how the poor make decisions is a necessary first step. And what I had all the examples I gave you on poor economics as well as the randomized controlled trials is to point to the necessity of understanding who you're trying to help, right? If taste is important, is more important than calories, your policy needs to address how to make food tastier. You can't just dump food on the poor and just because it's cheap, you hope that they will consume more calories and therefore be more productive. Doesn't work that way. The poor are just like us. They like tasty food, and you've got to find a way to make whatever you're trying to give them as calories taste better. Otherwise, it's just a waste. Because your food, your rice just gets thrown away. Why would you want to do that? If the poor find it difficult to prioritize chlorinating water before they drink it, make it easy for them to access chlorinated water. Or provide them with an incentive to get their children immunized. So those are just simple things, and they seem to be small steps, but they have huge implications on the health of the people in the village. And if you consider the spillovers, the benefits are greater than just the private. Poverty is huge in scope, and the poor are more complex than we think. What's striking is that the current approach to alleviating poverty rarely deals with the behavior of the poor. And this is the emphasis here, that the poor have a behavior that is, in some ways, is similar to us, in other ways is very different from us. We need to understand that in order to be able to help them. We can use 21st century tools to deal with a very, very old problem in small steps. And it's not easy, but I think it's something that is doable. All right, thank you.